for Sonia about the upload of the videos. I'm sorry, I know nothing about it, so I'm having to rely on others. So do you want to just tell them, and then we'll ask if there's questions?
Sure. So
Okay.
last week's videos got uploaded because they were never deleted. So I can't upload it at my house because the last time it took me about 9 hours to upload 2. So Saki volunteered last night, but because of the fact that none of the last week's videos were uploaded, those got uploaded first.
But it's fixed.
It's fixed?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Monday
now
or
it should be
okay.
fine, and hopefully we can get Monica to upload them right after class. But yesterday she had left, so we couldn't get it done right after.
Okay, so can everybody find what they need to find at this point?
Is it that one that you sent? The
Yeah, that
OCPA
link-
class?
Yeah, I
It's
think,
working,
so
it
they
didn't
did.
work for me last time, but I found it this morning.
Okay.
Everybody good? Okay, thank you all very much for taking care of that. I appreciate it. While you were on break, I distributed the injectable agents for the treatment of type 2, so you should have one of those if you want. Does everybody have one? Can you pass extras over to Kathy and Sonia? Okay, this next class, the alpha glucosidase inhibitors, they're a great class. They're not used very often. They're hard to use. They're hard for patients to tolerate. So these alpha glucosidase inhibitors are like big starch molecules that sit and occupy the disaccharide receptors in the microvilli of the small intestines. Okay, so they act like fiber. They just sit on that receptor. And so carbohydrate metabolism slows down, and it increases it over the length of the small intestines. Instead of most of it occurring right in the duodenum, it gets spread further over the rest of the small intestines. I like this drug because it stays somewhat outside the body. You can think of it. If you can think of the gut really being outside, if you can start in the mouth and get all the way out through the rectum, you never enter into the body. This drug does that. It stays in the gut. It never gets absorbed, doesn't affect anything outside of the gut. But it's hard to use. Have you ever tried to increase your fiber intake in your diet? What happens? You bloat, you get distended, you have lots of gas, okay? So it's a hard drug to use from that standpoint. It gives people all the same things that you get with fiber increase, you get with this drug. That's its main side effect. The other is that because of that, it's a very slow drug to titrate. So you usually have to start with the lowest dose once a day. And as they tolerate, and it may take several weeks, you can increase the dose. So it's slow going. Takes a lot of patient education. So that's the main problem I see with it. Had a guy who, and I love it for people who have mostly rises after they eat. Their fasting blood sugar's pretty good. Their A1Cs are maybe in the 7% range, not quite 8%. These are great drugs. But they usually are socially unaccepted drugs. I had a guy who started on this drug. He goes, I love the drug, but he goes, I can't use it anymore. I'm in a cubicle. I work with 4 women in tight quarters, and they have told me, get off the drug because his gas was so bad. So, again, the gut will develop a tolerance to it. It will get better, but it's just slow. Most people don't have that tolerance. So I think that's why mostly it is not used in great amount. The only other problem it has is that it impairs the breakdown of disaccharides. So you cannot use sucrose as a way to treat low blood sugar if it should occur. Now, it won't occur with that drug alone, but if you use it in combination with insulin or the sulfonylureas, you can get a delay in treatment. So when you use that drug and with others, you have to have the patient have a form of glucose, which is not hard to do, as a way to treat a load. Okay, so let's see if there's anything else. See, its postprandial drop is 50 to 60 points. That's big. It's too bad. It's a good concept. It just doesn't, in reality, doesn't work as well. I mean, it works, it's just hard for patients to tolerate. Okay. So on the next page, you see a picture of, I showed you pictures of, see, it really looks like that polysaccharide. So the polysaccharide's at the bottom, or oligosaccharide, and I think cargos shows you how it sits on those receptor sites. Okay. All right. Questions about it? I just want you to be aware of it. It's another one of the tools you could use.
Could you prescribe anything to help with those intolerable side effects? Like they make medications that are supposedly for flatulence and stuff like
Well,
that?
you could have them use those are usually surfactant, they decrease the surfactant. So like simethicone, you could. You know, I've never done that. I've mostly just started slow and try and warn them. So there wouldn't be any reason not to. No contraindication. Good thought. Okay, SGLT2 inhibitors. This is probably the newest group of drugs. They've been around for probably 5 to 7 years now. They're on the news a lot. You hear commercials for them. If you'll tune your ears for them, Invokana, Farxiga, Jardiance. These drugs, let's look at how they work. So if you look at the bottom, that renal handling of filtered glucose, so the kidney filters when the blood goes through the glomerulus and through the Bowman's capsule, all the sugar gets filtered out. It's a very small molecule. The pores are small, but in the Bowman's capsule, but the sugar can move out that filtrate with the filtering. Okay, so we don't want that to happen. So there are transport molecules in the proximal tubule, those SGLT2s and SGLT1s, that are responsible for getting all of that sugar out of the filtrate and putting it back into the bloodstream. So if you don't have diabetes or kidney disease, you are never going to see sugar in the urine. They're highly effective. And why? We don't want to let go of energy. We're created that way. Okay. So what happens though in diabetes is that transport system is limited. You ever gone to the post office at Christmas? Okay. So how many people are usually there to receive your packages?
1.
2, 3, okay. So as long as the incoming people match the time it takes for those people to do their job, no line forms, right? What happens though as soon as the incoming overwhelms the capacity of the 2 people that are there to get your packages somewhere? The line goes out the door. So it's like the kidneys, these transport molecules are the same way, capacity limited. So once you exceed that, then sugar goes into the urine. So the renal threshold is what we refer to is about 180 milligrams per deciliter in blood sugar. Once you exceed that, then sugar will start appearing. Okay. That's why when we talk about diabetes early on treatment, we try to get their blood sugars below that 180 mark, because then their symptoms go down. They're not spilling sugar into the urine. They're not polyuric. Their polydipsia is not great. They're not just hungry. They can hold on to the sugar that they've taken in. Okay. So if you look, we are filtering about 180 grams per day. That's a lot. So we figured that out though. How many grams of carbohydrate did Zane take in that one meal? Or in a day, in your meal? It was about 125. But we figured for somebody for 2,000 calories, 250 grams of carbs was about 50% of their caloric intake. So you can see how that 180 is in line with that. Okay? All right. So these products, if you look on the next page, 22, this blue, or it's blue if you've got color. These drugs inhibit that transport system. So no longer can sugar move back from the lumen of the nephron back into bloodstream. And so what happens at the end is that you have this sugar that ends up in the urine. So you're not going to reabsorb, filter, not all of it, not all of it, because you're not going to knock out all that transport system. But you are not going to reabsorb that sugar, so it's calories lost. So you lose about 200 to 400 calories a day when you use these products. So some weight loss can occur with it. The other thing that happens is they can lose sodium, and so they can have blood pressure problems, low blood pressure. What do you think about this? I just want your reaction to using a drug like this. Zane?
I just think maybe it's going to have other complications, like we learned that your risk of UTI increases when
Yeah.
you're constantly
Yes, and
urinating
that
sugar.
does happen. UTIs go up. I think it's the most bizarre thing, is to induce a pathology. I do. Personal opinion, I'm just giving my opinion. I think it is weird. So, okay, so it's a drug that's available.
So people on this drug would be less concerned about succeeding with this thing.
You would, yeah,
They would worry
it
about-
actually would be a pharmacologic endpoint, is for sugar to show up in your urine. So expected decreases about 1%. I'll tell you that I have used it in a few people. I have not seen it work. I just haven't seen it cause any effect. Usually you start at a low dose and you titrate up. Most of these have at least 1 or 2 titrations. But when I tell you things don't work, I have a focused population. African Americans, usually advanced disease, advanced complications. So I think in a healthier population, these may have better use. If you look at renal function, keep it in mind that, and it's important, renal function makes a difference in using these drugs. Okay. You can see with Invokana that the GFR 45 to 60, max dose is 100, that's the initial dose. If it's less than 45, it recommends not to use. With Farxiga, it's GFR less than 60, not recommended. So a lot of your patients aren't going to qualify. Probably your earlier patients who are earlier in disease. Jardiance, less than 45 mils per minute, not recommended. The other is when they need to be taken. Most of them are prescribed in the morning, with or without food. Jardiance also carries a FDA, it has met FDA criteria for a decrease in cardiovascular risk. So it carries a recommendation for use in people who have higher cardiovascular disease or at higher risk. Okay, so on page 23, let's go over to it. So again, they're going to lose about 200 to 400 calories a day. Some weight loss can occur. Slight osmotic diuresis because of the sugar in the urine. Reduction in blood pressure may occur 5 milligrams per millimeters of mercury and 2 for diastolic. That's average. You can see it be greater in some patients, particularly older patients. Safety and tolerability, increase in yeast infections in women, about 10 to 15%, increase in, as Zane pointed out, in UTIs. Can get an increased risk of hyperkalemia. So in those who are prone to that because of other drugs you're using, then need to monitor that serum potassium. Can increase LDL, symptomatic hypotension, increased risk of acute renal failure. This is a real problem with, which one is it? It's Farxiga has an increased risk in amputation. No, is it Canigla? No, it's Invokana. It's Invokana. So that's being investigated, and not sure what why that is, or what the mechanism is behind that. But I think it carries a warning now on the label. That is fairly new. But a really odd thing that this drug does is it causes, let me get to it. It causes a euglycemic diabetic ketoacidosis. So we usually see diabetic ketoacidosis in people who are usually have type 1. You can't see it in type 2, it's more unusual. But in type 1, it's usually due to insulin deficiency. You're breaking down a lot of fat, you're releasing free fatty acids, you get all those ketones produced by the liver, and you get a metabolic acidosis. This drug doesn't do any of that, but it causes an atypical DKA. So it's euglycemic in that usually people who come in DKA have elevated blood sugars because they don't have enough insulin. So it's usual to see DKAs in 300, 400, 500 blood sugars. These folks at relatively low numbers in the hundreds or in the low 200s will develop this DKA. So these are the usual presentations. People get very sick to their stomachs, they may have cramps, their vomiting is increased, they get dehydrated because they throw up a lot or they can't drink or take things down, so dehydration, or they're urinating a lot, they're peeing a lot. Fruity breath comes from the ketones. Increased pulse would go with the dry mouth or the dehydration. So that's a typical presentation. So for these folks, blood sugars are mildly elevated, less than 200. High anion gap metabolic acidosis. So here's what that looks like. You have a large number of unmeasured anions. Your bicarb is going to be, or your CO2 content on your Chem 6 or Chem 7 is going to be low, and your chloride is going to be decreased. Okay? So that's what their blood sugars are going to look like. So if you hold it, you're going to have a pH that's low, your CO2 content will be low, sodium could also be low, depending on how much they peed out. So they also have ketones in their urine. Triggers that were identified were major illness, reduced food or fluid intake, reduced insulin dose if they were taking it with insulin. In half the cases, no identifiable triggers. There were deaths due to this. People didn't recognize it. You went into the ER, nobody would anticipate it. So now it's become more part of what people are expecting or looking for if someone comes in the emergency room with an SGLT2. They're mostly type 2, which is very unusual for a DKA. So patient education needs to be done to warn these patients. If these symptoms occur, seek medical help. So I put one of those warning signs for you. A flag ought to go up in your brain if you use this drug and looking for knowing what their renal function is. Questions about that? I'll tell you in the scheme of things, I don't use the drug because one is that I didn't find it much value in the population I was taking care of. They're also very expensive drugs. And for the amount of lowering that you are expecting to get, you're not getting much. Insulin, you will always get a huge bang for your buck. Insulin can control anybody's blood sugar. The GLP-1s are expensive, but you can get a lot out of them. Metformin, cheap. Sulfonylurea is cheap. So that tends to drive what I use because of the population I dealt with. But if you've got a population that's got resources and has insurance, then your toolbox or the number of drugs that you have are quite large. So the thing I always do is I look at what is in the best interest of the patient. What will work best for them. and what are they willing to do. That usually drives how I put a regimen together for a patient. Questions about those? Remember, the things I tell you are my opinion, okay? So you may get out there, and if you work with an endocrinologist, I usually find endocrinologists have people on 5 or 6 drugs. And they use a lot of drugs for all their different mechanisms. And it seems to work for them and the population that they're dealing with. Comments? 2 other drugs, I'm not going to test you over these. These are not very commonly used. One is colesevelam. This is Welchol. It is a cholesterol-lowering drug, but it was found to have a pretty good impact on blood sugars. Just not used very often. Its contraindications are bowel obstruction, history of high triglycerides. It's a bile acid drug, so it will raise their triglycerides. What can you expect? About 0.5% for A1C. Let's see. They come in tablets and package. Mostly I just want you to know that it's out there. If you had somebody, I love drugs that I can get kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So if you have somebody who has lipids that would fit, management that would fit, this is a good drug to use for both of them. Don't need a lot of cholesterol or blood sugar lowering and have moderately elevated cholesterol. This would be a drug to think about. The other is bromocriptine. Bromocriptine is a dopamine agonist. We use it in acromegaly, in giantism. And it works very well because those folks usually tend to have diabetes as well. Because of the use and the experience in acromegaly with bromocriptine, then people started looking at using it in a wider circle. They're hard drugs to use. They have lots of side effects. The Parladil, Cyclacet is the brand name for diabetes. Fairly expensive. The only thing I'd say is keep those things always in mind. So when my usual fail, then I will look at these more limited ones for people. If you're working with patients who have acromegaly, this is a good one. And you'd be using it anyway to treat them. Comments about those? Very last is how do you treat kids with type 2? There is a huge study done. It's called the Today study. The pediatric endocrinology group at OU was a large part of that study and participated in it. So for kids, the drug that is approved for type 2 is metformin. It's really the only one that's approved for the use of an oral agent in kids. And that's about all I'm going to say about it. I would highly encourage you, if you have children that develop diabetes, is find the closest pediatric endo group. Because they will be very geared towards kids, and they'll have dietitians that are geared towards kids. Okay, that's all with the oral agents and the GLP-1s. Questions? Okay. So let's kind of look at how do you go about choosing? Let me kind of back up and do that. Let's go back to that chart. So when I always start with metformin unless there is a reason not to. Patients come in and say, I used metformin and I couldn't tolerate it. I ask them, okay, why couldn't you tolerate it? Tell me about that. If I find that I could probably salvage it and restart it because someone didn't use it appropriately, then I will try to do that. If they are dead set against it, then I look at what are the patient characteristics? Do you, first of all, I rule out, do you have any contraindication to any of the other drugs that are available? If their blood sugars are really high, I may try to talk to them about, let's use insulin to start with. So if I get patients that come in with A1Cs of 14, 15, 16%, they're type 2s, I will always talk to them about, let's use insulin for about 6 to 8 weeks. Let me get your blood sugars under much better control, and then I can convert you to an oral agent. When blood sugars are that high, it is a syndrome called glucose toxicity. It makes the beta cells sick. If you can get the blood sugars back down, the beta cells will recover to some extent. They'll usually recover to the point where you can use an oral agent. Usually a lot of it is what are they eating, what are they drinking, and if you can get them to start modifying that and then working with them on an oral agent, I've had lots of success in that way. So very high, if they have all those symptoms of polyuria, polydipsia, they've lost weight, that's the big one for me, is that I really go with insulin. Because it's telling you, the body is telling you with the symptoms it's presenting is that it cannot make enough insulin. Okay. Putting them on metformin doesn't do any good. You got to get the blood sugars down, doesn't take very long. I can do it in 4 to 6 weeks. And then get them to, if they'll listen and do what I say, then I can get their blood sugars to where the oral agents can tolerate them. So then what do I do next? It depends on clinical effect. That's why that clinical effect I've told you is important. I look at how far do you have to go. What else are you willing to do? Let me give you an example of a couple of people that I took care of that surprised me and taught me a lot. Had a lady who came in, she's a German lady, so she was short, very stocky, just block built, overweight, bad knees, A1C was 12%, her doctor sent her to me, she was on metformin and I think a sulfonylurea. Doctor said, I want you to go on insulin. She came to me and she goes, I'm not taking insulin. 12%. I said, well, it's very hard to get you down to goal or to get any improvement without using insulin. She said, I'm not going to do it. So we went through all the other options and she said, just tell me what it would take. What would it take with my diet and my exercise? And I said, well, your diet's actually not too bad. And I said, can you exercise? She said, I can exercise if I go slow. She said, my brother has diabetes and we walk every day and we can do about 2 miles in an hour. I'm like, this is never going to work. So I said, okay, here's what it will take. Here's what you have to do. And I said, and I'm going to see you back in 6 weeks, and if it isn't any improved, I said, here's what we need to do because of the consequences. Here's what's going to happen if we don't do something. So she came back, I don't think it was at 6 weeks, she came back about 8 weeks. And she and her brother had walked every day. She had done everything diet-wise that I had asked her to do. I took her A1C and it was 8%. I'm like, how did you do that? She said, I did what you said to do. And I was just blown away that she could do that much with the fact that she couldn't move that much. So it taught me a lot about not giving up on lifestyle, even in the face of very, very high blood sugars. Had another lady who came in, she was about 9%. She was in her 70s. Real quirky little lady. She came in, she goes, I'm not taking insulin. I don't care what Dr. Rama said, I am not going on insulin. So I listened to what she was able to do, and she had lots of carbohydrates. She lives by herself, she ate what she wanted to. Lots of, she loved mashed potatoes, she loved mac and cheese. She had a balance issue, so she wasn't wild about walking. But we talked about all the things she could do, and I said, okay, here's what it will take. And I saw her back in a couple of months, and lo and behold, she had gotten her A1C from 9% to 7.3% just by doing those things. So I have just learned over time that lifestyle is huge if you can get people to really adhere to it. So I really listen to what people are willing to do, and then I match a drug up. I usually will say, here are the drugs that I think will work for you. And I usually will tell them, here's the pros and the cons. Some patients I find will say, you choose. I don't know what to do. And I often think, you know, if I was going into a bank and I hate dealing with money. I'm glad Dr. Britton, he loves it. He's happy because he can get it down to where it's to the penny. I'm happy if I'm within $100, truly. I don't like managing money. Love to spend it, don't like managing it. So, I understand where they're coming from. So I'll tell them, here's what I think is best. Listening to you, here's what I would say we do. Usually they'll go with that. Others will go, that's what I want to do, so we go that pathway. So that's what I usually do. I match very much up to them, what their contraindications are, what their lifestyle. I listen a lot to what is your lifestyle, what are you willing to do, and I match up a drug to that. So any of these are workable. My go-tos are usually, I'm going to go with the sulfonylurea. You will find I bet a lot of endocrinologists don't do it, but I find it's got a lot of power. Or I will try to go with the GLP-1 agonist. If I can't get them to do that, or usually I can get them on a sulfonylurea, then I might go with the DPP-4 to buy me time. Buy me time to give them more time with lifestyle. It's like, what else could you do? If you don't want more drug, then what could you do? And I'll outline them. Here's what I see that you're doing that is causing a trouble. And see if I can bargain with them or negotiate with them a change. And usually I'll say, do it for 2 weeks, do it for 4 weeks, then come back and let's see what your blood sugars do. Can you give up sodas for 1 week? And let's see what your blood sugars look like. In 1 week, shoot, 2 days, they'll see a huge difference. Had a guy one time who came in, I was actually seeing him for lipids, and his fasting blood sugar was 190, and I said, how long have you had diabetes? And he said, I don't have diabetes. And I said, your fasting's 190, I'm pretty sure you have diabetes. He goes, I don't have diabetes. I'm like, okay. So in talking to him, I found he drank 2 liters of soda a day. I said, okay, if we can get you to decrease that. Now, I'm always really careful because if that's a lot of caffeine, oh man. Okay, so we exchanged the caffeine for other things, and we talked about what food to substitute, because if you take soda away, they get really hungry because they've suppressed their appetite with all that sugar. And he came back, and in giving up those sodas, his fasting blood sugar went back to about 90. I was shocked. I'm just telling you, I'm convinced food is the thing. And it's what people, so if you can get them to modify, that usually will go a long way. So that's usually how I start. I really do pay attention to all of these nuances of a drug and try to match it to what a person's willing to do. And then I see them back on a frequent basis. I may call them and say, tell me your blood sugars. I'll negotiate intensive monitoring for a few days to see what's happening. And I can do that over the phone, or I have them come back. When I'm seeing people early on, I'm usually seeing them, I never go more than a month, but I may call them in 3 to 5 days if I put them on insulin. Sometimes I call them the day after I start insulin just to see how it went, particularly if they were high anxiety or really didn't want to do it. So that's kind of the way I operate. But that was my focus, and that was what my job was. Questions about those? It is art and it is science. To deal with diabetes, you really have to work with folks who know it. The first person who taught me a lot about the practical aspects of diabetes was a PA that I worked with at the VA, Tis Bowman. She taught me a lot of practicality. I knew a lot about insulin, but she taught me the practical ways to do things. So be with somebody who knows, who has experience and can help. Listen to your patients, read, review, you'll learn. questions? All right, let's take a break. We'll come back at about 5 till, and we'll